ahead and hit. Thank you. So the session will be recorded and uploaded to Compass's YouTube page afterwards, so we can share it more broadly. If you're not comfortable being filmed at this hour of the morning, I completely understand. Please feel free to turn off your camera. Given the nature of the session, I'd recommend you switch to speaker view in the top right corner of your Zoom screen. We'll have the Minister with us for 30 minutes. If you'd like to put a question to her, please type it into the chat box. We're expecting a really well-attended session this morning, as you can see. So yeah, everyone's not on the panel will be muted to save on background noise. I'm expecting over 100 attendees, which is great. Goes some way to demonstrating the level of interest in this topic. But it does mean we're probably not going to get through everybody's questions, given the amount of time we got with the Minister. Spoke to officials yesterday to prep for the session, and we'll put questions we don't get time to cover to them after the event, use the answers to inform our future influencing work in this area. Excuse me. The session will be held in English. Questions in Cymraeg are very welcome. Please again pop those in the chat box. My colleagues will support with translation. Dwi'n dysgu and haplygu and araf, sorry. In terms of schedule, the Minister's due to arrive at 9, stay with us till 9:30. We'll hear from her about the Welsh Government's response, as I said, to the Local Government and Housing Committee's inquiry into community assets. And then we'll pass on to our panellists who have a few questions for the Minister. After that, I'll put a few of your questions to the Minister, many as we've got time for. And we'll wrap up then with reflections from the panellists, aiming to finish by about 9:45. So I'll introduce our panel at this stage. In alphabetical order, we're joined by Casey Edwards, who's a community-led housing enabler, and my colleague on the Communities Creating Homes team at Compass, Harry Thompson, economic policy lead at the Institute of Welsh Affairs, and Mae'r Davies, who's chief officer at Partneriaeth Ogwen, a community development focused social enterprise in Gwynedd. Can I pass over to each panelist now to sum up in a couple of minutes your interest in the topic, work you've done to promote access to community assets, to community-led housing, after which point we should be in a position to work on a Minister. I'll start with you, Casey, if that's all right.
Yep, thanks, Lou. Bore da pawb, morning everybody. It's so nice to see so many of you so early in the morning, so well done for getting up so early. So like Hugh said, I'm part of the Communities Creating Homes team at Compass and work as a community-led housing enabler. So work directly with community groups and organisations across Wales to help them to develop their community-led housing projects. And as many of our groups here today will recognise, one of the biggest challenges and barriers to actually developing community-led housing is access and acquiring land. So Compass has been working in the community-led housing sector for over 10 years now, and we've recognised, and the groups that we've worked with always come back to us saying that land is the most difficult thing to get hold of when developing their projects. So we decided to write a report on why it's such a problem and what we can do about it to make it easier for groups to develop their community-led housing projects. So our report found that Welsh communities do not have equal rights to those in other nations across the UK, especially in Scotland when it comes to deciding what happens to local land and assets in their local areas. So in Scotland, land reform legislation and the Community Empowerment Act allows communities to register an interest in land and assets and gives those communities the first right of refusal to bid for those land and assets when they come on the market. We unfortunately don't have the same privilege here in Wales. What we found in our report is that legislation and those acts have been absolutely transformative for the community-led housing sector, and it's allowed many groups to be able to get hold of land and assets to be able to develop their affordable housing projects and community-led housing projects. There's also in Scotland a large funding pot which goes hand in hand with this legislation, which again makes it easier for affordable housing projects to stack up and for communities to take real ownership over developing local housing. So obviously we developed this report which had a number of recommendations for the Welsh Government, including establishing a commission to look into innovative ways that we can legislate for greater community power, legislation, funding. I'm sure we'll hear lots today, but I'll shut up for now and hand over to Harry to talk about a little bit about his experience.
Thank you. I had to request to be unmuted. Yeah, thanks everyone for having me here. I'm Harry Thompson. I'm the Economic Policy Lead at the IWA. Last year, the IWA undertook research into communities and land use in Wales. We undertook interviews with experts in the area and interviews and roundtables with community groups and land managers. The communities we spoke to described a really arduous, demoralising process when dealing with asset transfer, including land in Wales. When it came to the CAT process of offloading publicly owned assets, we found that it was mostly a public body initiated process, driven by the demands of austerity. Communities told us that they felt untrusted and even bullied by the public organisations that they were dealing with. One gave an example of how chaotic the system can be. They told us that they received seed funding and took years gaining access to a particular piece of land. The council eventually agreed to lease that land, which was derelict for community use. They were in the process of redeveloping the land, and another council department from the same council arrived and told them they didn't think they had a right to be there and changed the locks. The group was running out of its seed funding and nearly collapsed as a result. And this was the best case scenario we found. When it comes to privately owned assets and land, as Casey mentioned, Wales's communities have no statutory rights at all, unlike in England where they have legislated for a community right to bid, and in Scotland where they've legislated for an even stronger and probably better community right to buy. Instead, communities here told us that then when they wanted to buy a privately owned asset that had come up for sale, they had no established legal identity or any funding to start off with, and were often up against legally established organisations with deep pockets, meaning that in practice they lost out. So just to finish, we recommended, amongst other things, developing tailor-made for Wales community empowerment legislation, including some kind of right to buyers in Scotland. We commissioned YouGov polling on this topic and found 68% of the Welsh public was in agreement with this proposal, and only 8% were against. Every single demographic and group of party supporters in Wales supported the proposal for community empowerment legislation. So we're really pleased to see the recent Senedd Committee report that Julie James is going to be talking a bit more about the Welsh Government's response to. We're really pleased that the Welsh Government has accepted nearly all of its recommendations yesterday, including a commission to look at the topic of legislation. But we're now looking forward to seeing a timescale to this commission reporting, because we've had a few commissions, we've had a few reports, including Compass and the IWA, and I think it's really time from the IWA's perspective to have some action on community empowerment. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I was caught in the mute zone. Thanks, Harry. Mae'r, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself, please, and a bit about your work, and then we'll welcome the Minister in. I think you'll be unmuted now too.
Bore da pawb. Ie, does am cyfieithu yma, felly ymddiheuriadau bod fi yn siarad yn Saesneg efo chi heddiw. Dwi'n hapus gymryd mi cwestiynau yn Gymraeg neu yn Saesneg, neu ffoniwch fi ar ôl y digwyddiad os ydych chi eisiau sgwrs. I'm Mae'r, and I work for a social enterprise called Partneraeth Ogwen. And over the years, we've developed a number of community asset projects. We have 9 buildings in Bethesda that we manage, and we've been able to buy those through a mix of either grants, loans. We've also done a community share offer to set up a community hydro scheme. We've also been lucky enough to receive buildings through community asset transfers, some of them through a social enterprise called Adwy, which was winding down. And we've also worked with Pwyllgor Gwynedd on 2 asset transfer projects, the library building and Canolfan Cynfais. Recently, we've been working on helping other communities as well to be developing assets, and that's been done through a project that Compass is leading with Welsh Government Welsh Division funding. So Dolwan is a collaboration between Siop Griffiths in Penygroes, Cwmni Bro Ffestiniog and Partneraeth Ogwen, and we're delivering the project up in North Wales, the Perthyn project. And also we've got Planed down in South Wales, Southwest Wales, doing the same kind of work. And essentially what we're trying to do is just inspire communities to be thinking about developing community-led housing projects and setting up new social enterprises. This work is really focused on startup. It's about inspiring communities, and it's not enough. You know, to develop a community asset project, you need a lot of women or manpower. You need, you know, it's not fair to be dependent on volunteers. It's so challenging. You need, you know, capacity. I'm just going to mention an event that we organised in Gallery Caernarfon about 3 weeks ago. We got over 40 community groups together to discuss community-led housing. And I'm just going to read 4 key messages really from that event. 1, community groups are really keen and interested in community-led housing and taking assets in their communities. 2, communities are really worried about the housing crisis. House prices are going up. Local people are not able to buy houses and live and work in the communities that they belong. They're also worried about the Welsh language and the impact on the Welsh language and the socio-economic fabric of their communities. 3, communities want to take ownership but lack the capital and the capacity to do so. And 4, I think this was really clear, communities feel overwhelmed by the housing crisis, and they felt that they needed a stronger voice, a cooperative voice really in this matter. So I'll just finish by mentioning really, based on that need for a stronger voice, Dolwan and other social enterprises in Gwynedd, we've been working with Adra, Grŵp Cynefin, Thai Gwynedd, Parc Cenedlaethol Eryri, and other partners to develop a cooperation agreement. And that agreement is just a clear declaration really that we need more action. And it's basically just to create that stronger community voice. And hopefully we can influence policy. And I think the fact that I'm invited here today, it shows, you know, a willingness for cross-sectoral collaboration in tackling the housing crisis. Diolch.
Brilliant, diolch Mae'r. A great introduction. Can I welcome at this point the Minister, who I think has joined us. Bore da, Minister, thank you for time this morning, much appreciated. So hot off the press yesterday afternoon, Welsh Government published a cross-departmental response to the recent Senedd Local Government and Housing Committee inquiry into community assets. As you can hear, we've assembled a crack panel today to discuss that response with you, to drill down into what sort of change Welsh communities can expect to see as a result of it. Before we move on to discussion with the panel and questions from the audience, are you happy to provide us with a bit of an overview of that response, the key points from your perspective, what we can expect from the next steps?
Yeah, thanks very much, Hugh. Very happy to do that and very happy to take part in the panel then for a discussion. From our point of view, this is the kind of beginning. I've long been very big fan of community-led housing anyway, and I'm very pleased to respond to the committee's report. This is obviously cross-government thing as well, though. It covers much more than my portfolio. So I'm going to concentrate on the housing bits of it, but obviously there are other community assets and so on that people are very interested in. So I'm also having to leave at 9:30, Hugh. I'm really sorry. So squash it all into that half hour. So apologies for that. So we're very much welcoming the publication of the report from the Local Government Housing Committee. And this is an initial response. We'll obviously be going into it in more depth as I discuss it with the committee itself and with yourselves as we move it along. So, you know, a couple of sort of truisms, really. We absolutely recognise that the communities are our greatest assets and central to our policies, exactly as Larry was just saying. What we really need to do is strengthen the community's ability to respond and help them to come together to do this. So we know that community assets in particular are you know, a focus of a community. So not just about the housing, this is about the community centres and the libraries and so on as well. So we know they're a focus for many a community, and those are assets that we really need to hang on to, particularly as we go into what is probably one of the worst budget periods we've ever had, given what the current government has just announced last Thursday. So trying to get the very best out of our communities in a, you know, a very difficult budget round will be really front and centre of what we want to do. And then, as Mallory said, and I caught the last bit of Harry's as well, you know, obviously the crisis is upon us, and so we need to be able to do some stuff pretty quickly. We also need to make sure that we don't try and sort of push a one-size-fits-all onto everyone. One of the problems with being in the government is trying to get things that are nuanced enough for each community to be able to take advantage of them whilst having a kind of set of rules that apply to people. And that's why I'm really, really happy to accept the recommendation about the creation of the commission to look at what more can be done to better empower and support communities, and to make sure that we get the terms of reference right. So we'll be looking for Compass to help us with stakeholder engagement to make sure we get those terms of reference right, and we get the time period over which the commission will work correct. So I think I heard Harry saying the time for action is now, and not just for chatting. I couldn't agree more. So what we'll want to do is have the commission to have a first task. What is the first few things that we need the commission to do? And then I would hope work with us along the road. In the way, some of you might be familiar with the way that we've done the Homelessness Action Group, who've provided us with a series of recommendations. We've been able to implement really practical recommendations. We've been able to implement and move the situation along. So that's the kind of structure I'd like to be able to duplicate for community assets, really. That kind of group of experts that come together from right across the whole series of engaged communities in Wales, and you know, give us a route map for how to get from where we are now to where we need to be. We know that the committee looked again at legislation. We know that we don't think it's necessarily the right option. We're very keen to see how the Scots and English legislation has come out. It hasn't been as successful as I think those two areas would like. I think actually Mallory's got it spot on there. It's not that there are things in the way, although I'm very happy for the commission to look at removing barriers that are in the way, or anything that needs enabling. It's much more about how we support and engage better with communities, and how we get that expert support into them to help them along the way, and not rely on volunteers, as she said. We're very keen to work on spreading out the good practice that we've already got. So we've got the Asedau Cymru network, I'm sure you are familiar with, all of you. So that's a network of public bodies that are looking to see what assets could be transferred, including housing or land assets from public authorities. And what we want to do is make sure that the data on that spreads out to include as many other organisations as possible. So we've had some really interesting conversations with other quasi-public bodies, like the Church in Wales, for example, and other people who also have land assets, Crown Estates, and some other people. So I'm really keen to do that. You'll know that we just set out a commitment to develop a communities policy, and again, I hope the Commission will help us with that. And again, here we'll need Compass to help us put that together. So we've got a cross-departmental in in the government, inside the government now, the sort of gubbins of the way the government works. We've got a cross-departmental communities policy board, and that will aim to strengthen the community voice in policy making and improve impacts across key policy areas. So they're actually working right now, and that board will help us identify the right community stakeholders to be part of the commission as well. So we're really looking forward to doing that. And then the other thing is that one of the frustrations in Wales is that good news is not a good traveller. So we do have, and Mallory just touched on a few of them, we do have some really good examples in Wales of some of the things that have really worked. So I'd be looking to have the Commission help us spread those good examples out and make sure that we get the best out of them. And we also learn from them. So I've had some really good chats with some of the people who've done community land trusts, for example, about some of the barriers that we could remove and some of the assistance that they could need. But access to land is one of the biggest problems that we have, as you know. So trying to get that sorted out will be absolutely crucial. So we'll consider the role and remit of the committee in more detail, and we'd be really pleased to hear from yourselves and IWA and other stakeholders in this about what that role and remit should look like. And then we'll do a review of the current guidance simultaneously as well. And again, we'd like stakeholder involvement in that. So that's co-produced so that we have guidance that actually helps us get local authorities in particular to engage with community groups, both around asset transfer more generally and in particular access to land for housing trusts, which I'm very keen to do. They'll also be looking at the type and degree of support currently available and then what the gaps are as well. So I'd be wanting to do that. The last piece I wanted to just say there is we'll want to look at how the long-term financing will work, because these things have to be sustainable, don't they? It's not about the instant of transfer. It's about how that group would then hold on to whatever the asset is. And in particular for housing, how is that sustainable over the longer term in terms of care and repair and tenancies and all the rest of it? Because you want to make sure that any housing that was either built or taken over stayed as a community asset and didn't somehow morph into private sector development. And I know that we've got lots of good examples of that around. And then the last thing we were looking at is a publicly owned data map Wales, as we've got, making sure that all the data around who owns what land across Wales and where it might be accessible is actually put onto that. So at the moment, it's about 85% of all ownership in Wales, and we're making inquiries into how we could expand the current data available to include all owners that might have available land. Because that's limited by the data currently available. And as I said, we've had some decent conversations with other quasi-public landowners about coming on board with that. We've also accepted the recommendation about strengthening planning guidance to local authorities. So Planning Policy Wales already recognises community assets are a key element of community infrastructure in some places. And so we're very happy to look to enhance the policy guidance around transfer and maintenance of community assets to make sure that local authorities have the best possible guidance for that. On the funding, we've already got the Communities Facilities Programme, which gives grants of up to 300,000 to help communities by development, improve community assets, buildings and green spaces. And we've also got a CAFAP, as it's called, the Communities Facilities Programme, which has already given out around 41 million in capital grants since 2017. We've also got a Community Asset Loan Fund, which is delivered by the WCVA for us. We're not planning for any of those programs to end. They'll continue to evolve and so on. So what I was planning to do was, rather than accept the recommendation for a separate funding stream, which is what the committee has asked for, is actually to include a review of existing funding streams in the terms of reference to the Commission, so that we can look in some depth about whether the current funding streams actually work or whether morphing them into something else might work. What I don't want to do, I'll be really upfront with you all, is add another one, because what we tend to do that in Wales, layer more things in and just makes it more complicated. So I'd be very keen for the Commission to have a proper look at that. And then the housing stream will be included in that, basically. So we'll make sure that there's a specific housing stream. And then I'm sure that you're all aware, and I know Compass is aware, that we are specifically funding a community land trust in Swansea at the moment, in Rebecca Evans's constituency, very near where I live, actually. I'm really hoping that that will be successful and that we can learn some lessons from that, and then we can spread that that learning out across, across Wales to make sure that we can take advantage of that. And again, the Commission can help us do that and do the evaluation of that for us to make sure that that works. That's a really exciting project, and I'm really keen that it goes well. And then obviously here we provide Compass with funding, and we've just upped that by 180,000 a year, as I know you know, support community-led housing groups in Wales. And then just to say that, as always, this is part of a much bigger housing problem that we've got across Wales. So we're still investing record amounts of money in social housing across Wales, and we're working with the cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru, a whole series of things around social housing allocation policy, the Welsh language community housing programme, to make sure that we can have a look at ensuring that people who've grown up in a community can access social housing in that community in the right way, and that we have a kind of fit for purpose allocation policy, as well as being able to build small amounts of social housing in a large number of villages right across Wales, because that's what's required, rather than I'm not at all keen to build big single tenure estates as was done in the 50s. Those haven't worked for a variety of reasons. So what we're looking for is good placemaking, well planned out mixed tenure estates. So just to say that that's not part of this discussion we're having today, but it's very much part of the government's overall strategy for how to map the housing crisis. And I'm delighted to say that on Thursday, the Renting Homes Act will come into force in Wales as well, which will transform the private rented sector and give a lot more security of tenure to tenants. And later on today, we have the regulations going through to extend the 6 months notice provisions to existing tenants as well. So I'm really pleased to do that. And I've spoken to Planed and the Solver people and a number of the RSLs up in North Wales, where Mae'r has been working, about the success of some of those projects. And we'd be looking to make sure that the Commission has a look at all of the various examples around Wales to see whether we can get some learning out of that to spread out into areas where we don't have any community land trusts working at the moment, or we don't have communities that have been able to, for a variety of perfectly reasonable reasons, to come together to do that. So that's a sort of, I don't know what you'd call it really, a sort of canter through the various responses to the report. But I'm really happy to answer questions and have a discussion about it here.
Super. Thank you very much, Minister, and it is a gift that you are able to get through so much information so quickly and so clearly in such a short space of time. Yeah, really pleased to hear about the commitment to involving stakeholders in this work. I think modelling on the homelessness action group is a great idea, and from my own experience, I thought that worked really well. Yeah, I won't tarry any longer. We'll move straight on to questions from our panelists. In the interim, if people want to submit questions for the Minister or for the panel, please go ahead and put them in the chat. I've got a couple of questions that have come through from community groups who couldn't be here today, which I can put to the Minister as well. But I will move on to a question from Casey first, please.
Thanks, Sue. And thanks, Minister. You've already answered some of my questions, so that's great. My question today specifically is around data and information about land and assets. So our report called for data and information to be more open, transparent and more widely available. We've heard a little bit this morning about the progressive legislation in Scotland, and their Land Commission is now calling on the Scottish Parliament to introduce a transparency obligation that would require options agreements and conditional contracts over land to be disclosed on a public register that is kept updated. So how can we make it as easy as possible for community initiatives in Wales to find out about land and assets in their communities and ultimately take ownership of them? Would the committee's recommendation of establishing a register of community assets assist with this, to enable people to be able to go to that list and find out more information about their about the land and assets, and see ultimately what people's plans are for them within their community? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. So I think we've kind of come along that road from a different direction, really, but we're going to the same place. So the stuff I was talking about around Asedau Cymru and Data Map Wales, what we'd like is to pull those two pieces of work together to include all of the information that you've just discussed and that I was also discussing. So at the moment, that's got around 85% of what we think of a likely public assets in Wales that might be available for community land or community ownership or community management or some kind of community arrangement across them. And I'd be really keen to work with making sure that the data was available for all of the things you just listed, really, all of the things that help communities see what might be available and then help them start the process of putting a plan together to see how they can sustain those facilities. So again, looking at the Commission, I'd be really pleased to have them look at, you know, what's happening elsewhere in the UK, actually across the world for that matter. There are other areas that do this really well, and to see what could be put in place to ensure that we have that kind of community ownership, because I think it's pretty fundamental, isn't it, to be able to understand what you're looking at before you can take it over. So yes, I think it's, you know, the answer is yes, we can make sure that the Commission's terms of reference are wide enough to do that, that we have people on the Commission who have the expertise to be able to help us do that. And obviously the Commission would be supported by a secretariat and officials in the Welsh Government who can actually do the legwork to make sure that we do some of that stuff. So I'd be really keen to do that.
Thanks, Minister. Harry.
Yeah, thanks, Minister, for your speech. I have to say, I'm feeling more positive about everything already. Hearing it, it's good to see just the Welsh Government engaged on this issue. My question is about privately owned assets and leading into legislation, which you touched on a bit already. So obviously the CAP process only applies to publicly held asset disposal. But when it comes to privately held assets, we found that, as I mentioned in my speech, I'm not sure if you were on for this bit, that communities found that when a privately owned asset came up for sale, that they didn't have a legally established identity and they didn't have any funding, and they're often competing against organisations with quite deep pockets, obviously a team of staff, and the result was normally they lose out, essentially. Quite a few organisations, the IWA, BCT, Compass, as we mentioned, Coalfield Regeneration Trust, and even Camera for community-owned pubs have said that they think the answer to this is legislation. I got to say, when I was going through the research, even with the flaws that have been seen in particularly the English system and the Scottish system, even with the gaps that could be fixed in those provisions, it was really hard to see a way without legislation that we could empower communities to buy those privately owned assets. In your evidence, the inquiry, you told the committee that the Welsh Government prefers a slightly different approach in Wales to the legislative approach in England and Scotland. I'm really pleased that the Commission has accepted the recommendation to look at legislation, but I'm kind of wondering, if the Welsh Government doesn't want to legislate, how does it propose that communities can have that fair access to compete for privately owned assets in the market?
So I would say we've slightly more open minds than that. So if the Commission said that the only way that we could do something was to legislate because, there was some big barrier that required, I don't know, whatever it is that it required in legislation, then, we'd be happy to look at that. What I was talking about in the committee was this Senedd term. There's absolutely no way, there's no point in beating around the bush. There's absolutely no way we'll be legislating in this Senedd term. We'd be really lucky to get the whole of our current legislative programme through in this Senedd term. There isn't a gap for this kind of legislation. And quite honestly, I'm sorry to be a bit depressing this time of the morning, but if the current government goes ahead with a bonfire of EU regulations on Habitat Directive and so on, then we're going to lose some of the legislation we've got while we fight that off, frankly. So there's no point in me saying that we can do it this Senedd term because we can't. But if the Commission was to recommend legislation, then the route for that would be to get it into the manifestos of as many parties as humanly possible. Sorry for the politics of this, but that's likely to be my party, Labour, implied, isn't it? Because I don't think the Tories are into this particularly. But if you could get it into everyone's manifesto, that would be even better. And then you'd have a fighting chance for the next Senedd. But so what I was talking about was looking to see what was possible now so that we didn't just hang around waiting for legislation. So what's possible given the current set of circumstances. It's also sometimes easier to remove barriers than it is to put new things in place. So, you know, if there are things that are currently acting against, so the way that particular funds work or particular restrictions work, then we could have a look at that. I can see that in the chat, for example, somebody saying that a mixture of a community asset, a flat and a garage is causing them problems because it comes into too many different fields. That's the kind of thing I think is quite relatively easy to fix. So looking to see how you can make sure that we haven't got artificial barriers for funding and so on. You don't need legislation to do that. We can do that pretty rapidly. But I wasn't kind of ruling it out forever. It was just the reality of the situation as we are currently seeing it. So, you know, more than happy to, if the Commission comes up with that, then that will have to be factored in at a later date. That's all, Harry. Really.
Great, thank you, Minister. And Mallory.
Diolch yn fawr. I'm going to come back to that crucial word, capacity. Communities need more than signposting, and the work that the CLT group at Compass are doing is great, and the Perthyn project is great, but it takes people to a cliff edge. What happens after that support? I just wanted your views on that, please.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Mallory. So you'll know that in the work we're doing on the Doiver project, I hope that we've actually employed community, I don't know what we've called them actually, community assistants anyway, because we recognise that. So basically, I think that's what it means. It means it needs us to employ people whose job it is to continue to assist that community. So you're not pivoting around a particular individual. And you often see with these things, don't you, that the community's lucky because they just happen to have somebody in it who happens to be a surveyor or a lawyer or whatever it is and has the skill to be able to do it. And then other communities that are just as keen and enthusiastic but don't happen to have somebody with the right skill in it struggle a bit more. So I think that the way forward for that is for us to employ those community engagement officers or whatever it is we've called them. Forgive me for not being able to remember, but and part of the Doiver pilot is to see how that works. So part of the feedback that we'll get from that is to see how those roles function, how they engage with the community, how good they are at getting that community engagement to come together. There's no point in me pretending that we'd be able to fund it without the community involvement, but you're absolutely right. You need a paid person to kind of keep pulling it all together. I completely agree with that. And you see that over and over again, frankly, in every aspect of what we do. So, you know, right from the sort of Save the Curlew group right down to the housing thing, a lot of it is volunteer and community activism, but it pivots around a sustainable funding model that allows a paid person or more than one paid person to be the core. So, you know, I think that's self-evident. I'm sure the Commission will tell us that in no uncertain terms, because that's been the case, you know, well, all the years I've been doing this, which is a long time now. So I completely get that. And the other thing is to establish a sort of central resource, I think, of people who have those skills, who can be called on for free by the community, you know, to bring their skills to bear. So you can, you know, all the various people, the surveyors and lawyers and all the rest of it, that builders and whatever, that you need to be able to do some of these things. So we need to be able to establish that kind of central resource that people can call on as well. And we need to fund that, it seems to me. But I don't want to prejudge the Commission. These are just things I'm sort of fairly certain they'll come up with, because we know that they've worked elsewhere.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate you.
Hugh, I've just been asked in the chat here, I can see, about the Crown Estates. So just to say that we've pushed for the Crown Estates to be devolved to Wales. They are devolved in Scotland. They were devolved in Scotland by David Cameron as part of the last referendum. Argument, bribe, I don't know what word you want to use there. They are currently refusing to devolve them to us, but if everyone on this call wants to write in to the Secretary of State and demand their devolution, I'd be very happy.
Maybe we need an independence referendum.
Oh,
Everything's along.
It'd be interesting to see what money came our way if that happened, wouldn't it?
Can I ask, Minister, I appreciate you've got to go, two extremely quick questions, hopefully. One on timescale. Can the Minister advise us when she'll require the Commission to produce its report? And secondly, on whether the NHS estate will be considered as part of this work.
I don't know the timescale. One of the things I want to do is work with yourselves and others to set the Commission up, to get the terms of reference right and to get the timescale. And as I said at the beginning, Hugh, I think there'll be a range of timescales. There'll be a need for an initial quite quick report, as we did with the Homelessness Action Group. So a first set of high-level recommendations and an action plan. And then I think it's an ongoing piece of work for quite some time, I would think, exactly as the other groups have worked. So I don't have anything in my head for that. I think I would be very much in the hands of the experts on the Commission to tell me how long it would take them to do the work. And I'm very happy to run with that. And so we'll start that piece of work straight away, basically. So we'll start to get you together to to pull the stakeholders together to start working on that terms of reference. And I'm sure, Hugh, that Compass will have a big role in the centre of that to help us do that. I forgot the second part of your sentence. Sorry, what was the second question?
The second question was about whether the NHS estate would be considered.
Oh, yeah. So the whole of the public estate is involved in it. I mean, that'll be a reference to the Bron Lice thing. The issue there is to work out with the health authorities and health boards what they need to use and what could be used in a different way. So this is what I meant about it. It hasn't got to be about ownership. It's got to be about management and other ways of working as well. So it hasn't got, I don't think this is just about, it was the local authority's piece of land and now it's the community's piece of land. So there has to be a range of things, it seems to me, available for joint use, community use, management, ownership. There's a kind of spectrum, isn't there, of available possibilities, and I think that an open discussion about what best suits each piece of land and what the outcome might be from that is the way forward myself. But again, the Commission will be able to give us some direction in that. Sorry, and I say I've talked myself out of my time as well. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Thank you, and sorry if I pushed it. Yeah, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to continuing the discussion.
Pleasure, and give us some feedback from the rest of your day. That'd be really interesting. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye now. Bye.
Brilliant. Well, I feel quite buoyed after that. I think. Not delighted about the response on legislation, but at least we have absolute clarity as to where we stand, what we need to do next. I think part of my buoyancy is because of the sort of breadth and number of people who are clearly interested in this work. There's a huge movement of people across Wales who are clearly really want to see more power devolved to communities, more ability for communities to take control of assets, be that the local park, be that housing. And I think today has been a really good next step on that journey, and there's a lot for us to build on as Compass, as a wider movement of communities and community supporting organisations. So yeah, there's work to do undoubtedly, but positive steps. Could I ask and I just wanted to say thank you for all the questions, everybody, and apologies if we didn't get to yours. As I said, we will try and as the Minister said, I'll send some reflections over and we'll try and pick up with officials. Could I ask for reflections from the panel? I guess we'll stick with the order we've established. Casey.
There we go. Sorry, I decided to keep myself muted then, probably best. So yeah, I think I echo your thoughts too in terms of legislation. It's disappointing, and I think Harry summed it up really nicely in terms of the communities aren't going to have the same powers as Scotland and England if we don't legislate for this. But like you said, it is nice to know where we stand. And I think, you know, it's our job now as stakeholders to do just as the Minister said, and campaign for this to be included in, you know, all party manifestos moving forward, so that the next next election, this can be a consideration and move forward perhaps in the next term of government. So yeah, I think it's very positive. I think the Minister seems to be very on board with these recommendations that open for discussion. I'm really excited that she's happy for stakeholders to be involved in the Commission, and I think it's really important now that we look at examples in Scotland and England, what's worked well and what hasn't worked particularly well. You know, we're very clear that the legislation in Scotland isn't perfect, and the legislation in England certainly isn't perfect. So I think it's time now to learn lessons and develop. I think we've always said at Compass that we're in a really good position, even though we're behind the situations in Scotland. We are in a really good position now to learn those lessons and to develop something bespoke that really works for Wales. So yeah, excited to see that move forward, and even that sort of she mentioned the homelessness action group and the way that they've sort of developed some first tasks and some first actions. I think that's a really good approach, given that legislation isn't likely to happen.
Absolutely. Thank you, Casey. Harry.
Yeah, the same as Casey. Really positive discussion, I think, and I just appreciate the frankness about there's no time for legislation. So I'm glad they just went out and said it, because, you know, we've kind of suspected that anyway. I think it lines up really nicely for the next manifestos, which Julie James gave a hint to there. I think, you know, we'll have a commission. It's going to, by the sounds of it, have that first high-level report reasonably quickly. And I think then we'll be going into Welsh Labour leadership election, most likely, and then into the Senedd elections. And I think there will be recommendations there, solid recommendations for political parties to pick up. And obviously the Welsh Government sounds as though it is pretty open to the idea of legislation. I don't think it's convinced, but I think it's open to it, which is definitely a change, to be honest, from where it was previously. And I agree with what the Minister said when it comes to, you know, there are other things you can do as well as legislation. It's not all about legislation. I think it's a package of supporting communities, of funding, and then there's also legislative and statutory rights that's important, I think, when it comes to empowering communities. So I think it sounds like all of those things are now on the table in a field that was pretty had stalled a bit a couple of years ago. So I think it's I think, yeah, just really positive. And if we keep up the pressure on the Welsh Government, and everyone who's involved in talking to the Commission makes the case for it, that even though, you know, the English legislation is slightly underpowered and the Scottish legislation, a lot of what has happened in Scotland has happened outside the legislative context. But I think we also need to be pointing out that just because they haven't used the formal legislative processes doesn't mean the fact that those processes are there as an underpinning, as a threat for community to go to. They can get, you know, sellers essentially tied up in that system that can encourage community buyouts anyway, even though they aren't used. So I think it's making the case that the Scottish system has worked, even if it hasn't been through the systems, and the fact that we can improve on that as well, and to go from having the least statutory powers for communities in Britain to having the most.
Absolutely. Thank you, Harry. Mallory, were you reassured with regard to capacity? Any other takeaways?
In terms of legislation and setting up a commission, you know, these things take time, and we're in a housing crisis. So yeah, obviously we welcome what she said, but I think it is a crisis, and in that context, you know, communities will just have to kind of carry on and probably do a lot by themselves. Yeah, but she did mention Dwyfor, and she did suggest potentially rolling out the Dwyfor model, and I think that's to be welcomed, because she did acknowledge the need for paid capacity to help communities to deliver these kinds of projects. So I obviously welcome that. In terms of funding, you know, she was emphasising the funding packages which are already available, so CAFAP and WCVA funding and so on. So there wasn't anything new from what I heard in terms of funding. So that's something that needs to be kind of highlighted with the Commission, I think. Yeah,
I think on funding, I was obviously, we were pretty disappointed when we read yesterday afternoon that if in the 16 recommendations, 15 were agreed or agreed in principle, apart from the one on funding for community-led housing. We were a little frustrated to read that, but I feel a bit more positive having heard the minister discussing that today. As she mentioned, the community group we're working with in Swansea will be submitting a bid to Welsh Government, which we're really seeing as proof of concept. If we can get this one over the line, it could open up a funding source for community groups, which would be really, really valuable in terms of getting them to a developable stage. And that wider review of funding streams as to their appropriateness for this sort of work is going to be a really important part of what the Commission does next. I think my initial disappointment was tempered a little bit by what the Minister said today. We've had a message from Richard Baker from Welsh Government in the chat to say he's happy for us to pick up questions that the Minister hasn't been able to cover today. So thank you very much for that, Richard. We will certainly take you up on that. And I think with that, we'll draw to a close. Thank you very much to the panelists for the contribution. Thank you to everybody who's submitted questions. I think, I think we've seen a step forward. It's not necessarily the leap forward some of us were looking for, but we're making progress, chipping away at this issue. And I'd like to thank everybody who's contributed today. We'll make sure that the link is shared on YouTube. We'll keep in touch. If everybody's happy to be emailed with Welsh Government's response to questions, etc., we'll send out an email to attendees with those responses, with the link, and we'll endeavour to make sure we keep in touch with everybody and really try and bring in as many voices from across Wales as we can into the ongoing work of this commission and beyond. So diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much, and cheerio.